A chilling discovery from the past has become the most talked about photograph in history. Experts examining an old photo of three friends from 1899 were left utterly speechless when they zoomed in on the seemingly innocent image. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Robert Smith's hands trembled with anticipation as he carefully extracted the sepia photograph from the dust-choked shoebox. The attic in Cheyenne, where he'd been conducting his research, was stifling, but the historian barely noticed the heat. His focus remained entirely on the image now resting in his palms, an artifact that had been hidden away for over a century. "This could be nothing," he whispered to himself, a habit formed during years of solitary research at the University of Wyoming. Yet something about this particular photograph made his pulse quicken. At first glance, it seemed ordinary enough. Three weather-worn men standing before a rough-hewn log cabin, their expressions stoic beneath the shadow of lowering clouds. Each man held a rifle, their stances suggesting both camaraderie and vigilance. The date scrawled on the back read October 18th, 1899. Robert adjusted his glasses and leaned closer, studying the faces that stared back at him across the vast expanse of time. The eldest appeared to be in his 40s, with a thick moustache and eyes that had witnessed hardship. Beside him stood two younger men, similar enough in appearance to suggest kinship. "The Davis brothers," he murmured, recalling mentions of them in his previous research. The backdrop of wind-bent grass and distant Wyoming foothills whispered of a world both raw and unyielding, a frontier where survival demanded grit and determination. The researcher reached for his magnifying glass, methodically examining every detail of the photograph as he'd been trained to do. The cabin's construction, the men's clothing, the positioning of shadows, all might offer clues to authenticate the image's provenance. It was then that something caught his eye. A small detail on one of the rifles that he might have missed entirely had the light not struck it just right. Robert adjusted the magnifying glass, his breath catching as he focused on what appeared to be a carving on the stock of the weapon held by the eldest man. A chill raced down his spine as the symbol came into focus. A serpent devouring its own tail. The Ouroboros, ancient symbol of eternity and renewal, seemed wildly out of place on a frontier rifle, yet Robert recognized its significance immediately. "It can't be," he whispered, his academic skepticism battling with growing excitement. If this was indeed what he thought, the personalized weapon of Marshal Peter Davis, whose mysterious disappearance had become legendary in Wyoming history, then this photograph might rewrite everything historians thought they knew about that fateful autumn of 1899. Robert carefully set the photograph down, his mind already racing with questions that demanded answers. Who were these three men really, and what secret had they carried to their graves? Robert Smith squinted at the photograph, convinced the mark he'd spotted was merely a flaw in the aging paper. Adjusting his desk lamp, he carefully placed the image under his digital magnifier. As the pixels sharpened on his screen, his heartbeat quickened. There, etched into the wooden stock of the rifle held by the man on the left, was an unmistakable symbol, a serpent devouring its own tail, the Ouroboros. "This changes everything," he whispered to the empty room. The researcher ran his fingers through his hair, mind racing. That symbol wasn't random decoration. Throughout his studies of the American frontier, Robert had encountered references to this mark, a symbol of eternal justice that appeared in tales of frontier vengeance, whispered about in saloons from Wyoming to Montana. It was said to be the personal mark of lawmen who operated beyond the constraints of traditional justice. He reached for his phone, fingers trembling slightly as he dialed. This discovery required expert confirmation. "Arthur? It's Robert. I need you to see something, today, if possible." 3 hours later, Arthur Johnson leaned over the photograph in Robert's study, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. The archivist's methodical examination was punctuated only by occasional murmurs of interest. "The symbol is authentic to the period. Arthur confirmed, straightening his back. But there's something else here that's equally significant." He pointed to the bottom right corner of the sepia image, where faded lettering was barely visible. "This is Albert Finch's signature. I'd recognize it anywhere." Robert leaned closer. "The photographer. Not just any photographer," Arthur explained, excitement evident in his voice. Finch was notorious for his meticulous documentation. He kept extensive notes on every subject he photographed. Names, dates, locations, even personal anecdotes. If this is truly his work, there might be corresponding records somewhere. The two men studied the three figures in the photograph, their weathered faces, the rigid posture, the unwavering gazes directed at the camera. These weren't men posing for a casual memento. There was purpose in their stance, a silent communication in their expressions. "Look at their eyes," Robert said softly. "They're not just friends posing for a picture. They're men with a mission." Arthur nodded slowly. "The combination of Finch's signature and this symbol, it suggests we're looking at something far more significant than a family keepsake." "A visual testimony," Robert murmured, "to something history has forgotten or deliberately buried." The two men exchanged glances, both understanding that the photograph had just become the first piece in a much larger historical puzzle, one that might rewrite the stories of justice and vengeance in the closing days of the American frontier. Robert Smith's analytical mind refused to rest. For 3 consecutive nights, he hunched over his desk in his modest Cheyenne apartment, surrounded by stacks of photocopied records and digital printouts. The date etched on the back of the photograph, October 18th, 1899, became his obsession as he cross-referenced it with every historical document he could access. "There has to be more," he muttered to himself, rubbing his bloodshot eyes as dawn broke on the 4th day. The historian's meticulous nature wouldn't allow him to leave any stone unturned. He'd already combed through local newspaper archives, finding only vague mentions of 3 bounty men passing through town that week. The breakthrough came during his visit to the University of Wyoming archives. After hours of careful searching through fragile, yellowed boxes, Robert's hands trembled as he discovered a leather-bound journal belonging to Albert Finch, the photographer whose distinctive signature marked the corner of the mysterious image. "October 18th, Robert whispered, his finger tracing the elegant script. 3 gentlemen arrived at my studio today: Michael Davis, his brother Paul, and their cousin George Brown. They requested a memento of their gathering before departing on what they termed urgent business." The journal entry continued with remarkable detail, describing the bitter Wyoming wind that had nearly toppled Finch's equipment as they relocated to shoot outside the cabin. The photographer had noted the peculiar stillness that seemed to surround the 3 men despite the howling weather. "Though they stood together as companions," Finch had written, "I sensed an undercurrent I dare not name. Their eyes held secrets darker than the gathering storm clouds. When the younger Davis brother placed his hand on the rifle, that magnificent piece with its curious marking, the others exchanged glances that spoke volumes without a single word uttered." Robert leaned back in his chair, absorbing the implications. The diary revealed more than just names. It captured an atmosphere, a tension that radiated from the photograph itself. These weren't simply 3 friends posing for posterity. They were men bound by something profound, perhaps dangerous. He carefully photographed each page of Finch's journal with his smartphone before returning the fragile document to its protective sleeve. As he walked through the quiet university corridors toward the exit, Robert couldn't shake the feeling that he'd uncovered only the surface of a much deeper mystery, one that connected these 3 men from 1899 to something that had remained hidden for over a century. Robert Smith's heart raced as he uncovered the next layer of the mystery. The archives revealed a startling truth. Michael Davis and Paul Davis weren't merely acquaintances but brothers, bound by blood yet divided by bitter animosity. Their father's recent death had ignited a fierce dispute over the family ranch and cattle. a conflict that had consumed the small Wyoming community just weeks before the photograph was taken. "Look at this," Robert whispered to Julia Martin, sliding a yellowed newspaper across the table. The Cheyenne Daily's gossip column painted a vivid picture of public confrontations between the siblings. One particularly heated exchange at the general store had ended with Paul threatening to put a bullet in his brother if he stepped foot on what he considered his rightful property. The historian traced his finger along the faded text. The whole town was taking sides. Michael claimed their father promised him the north pasture in a verbal agreement, while Paul had a written document covering the entire estate. "Yet here they are," Julia observed, tapping the photograph, "standing together like nothing happened." Court records showed restraining orders filed and withdrawn, accusations of forged documents, and testimonies from neighbors describing shouting matches that echoed across the prairie. The brothers had become bitter enemies, their relationship seemingly damaged beyond repair. George Brown's presence added another layer of complexity. As their cousin by marriage, he had initially tried to mediate the conflict, but eventually sided with Paul, believing the written will should stand. This betrayal had cut Michael deeply, according to a letter Robert found addressed to the local sheriff. "Three men who couldn't be in the same room without violence," Arthur Johnson noted, adjusting his glasses as he examined the photograph. Now standing united, with the marshal's rifle prominently displayed, Robert leaned back in his chair, mind racing. The feud had been real and vicious, with property destroyed and threats exchanged. Yet something powerful enough had emerged to override years of building resentment and unite these three men in what appeared to be a solemn pact. What could possibly be strong enough to heal such a divide? He wondered aloud, studying their expressions. The brothers stood rigidly, neither looking at the other, yet their stance suggested a temporary truce, a purpose that transcended personal grievances. The researcher ran his fingers through his hair, contemplating the transformation. Whatever brought them together that day was more important than land, money, or pride. Julia nodded slowly. Something like justice or revenge. The photograph seemed to pulse with unspoken meaning, as Robert considered what force could have been powerful enough to unite three bitter enemies in such grim solidarity. Arthur Johnson spent days hunched over the archives at the University of Wyoming, his fingers carefully turning the brittle pages of Albert Finch's journals. The archivist's dedication to historical accuracy was legendary among his colleagues. He'd once spent 3 months verifying the authenticity of a single letter from the territorial governor. "Robert, you need to see this," Arthur called, his voice echoing through the quiet room. He pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose as Robert Smith approached. Finch was obsessive about documentation. He kept meticulous records of every photograph, subjects, locations, even what they were wearing. The historian slid a leather-bound notebook across the table. Robert's eyes widened as he scanned the neat handwriting, detailing the October 18th session. Finch had noted everything, the approaching storm, Michael Davis's torn left boot, even Paul's recent shave. "Look at this entry about the firearms," Arthur said, tapping a paragraph with his index finger. "The rifle Michael is holding, it's described as the Marshal's serpent-marked Winchester." Robert felt his pulse quicken. Marshal Peter Davis's personal weapon. "The very same," the archivist confirmed. "The serpent devouring its tail. The Ouroboros was his mark. Every outlaw in 3 territories knew it. It symbolized the eternal nature of justice, that the law would always catch up to them eventually." They exchanged a meaningful glance. Marshal Davis had vanished just 3 days before the photograph was taken. His disappearance had shocked the territory, sparking manhunts and wild rumors, but his body was never found. "This changes everything," Robert whispered. "If Michael had the Marshal's rifle," Arthur nodded gravely, "either he was involved in the Marshal's disappearance, or he was seeking justice for him," Robert finished. The archivist pulled out another document, a yellowed newspaper clipping reporting the Marshal's vanishing. The official story claimed he was ambushed by the Red Creek Gang while riding alone. but no evidence was ever found. Robert studied the photograph again, seeing it with new eyes. The weapon in Michael's hands wasn't just a rifle, it was a statement, a declaration that carried weight no one in Wyoming had dared speak aloud since the day the lawman disappeared. "And the serpent," Robert murmured. "It's not just a marking, it's a promise." Arthur's weathered face creased with concern. "The question is, were these men breaking that promise or fulfilling it?" Outside, the wind howled against the windows of the archive, as if the ghosts of Cheyenne were listening, waiting for their story to finally be told. Robert Smith's analytical mind wrestled with the facts, but his heart felt the pull of something deeper. The yellowed pages of Marshal Peter Davis's case file lay spread across his desk in his cramped apartment, each document a fragment of a puzzle that refused to come together. He traced his finger over the official report of the ambush that had claimed the lawman's life, noting inconsistencies that previous investigators had overlooked. "Something doesn't add up," he muttered to himself, adjusting his reading glasses. The historian had spent enough time studying frontier justice to recognize when evidence had been sanitized. The marshal's death had been attributed to a random attack by unidentified assailants, yet the precision of the ambush suggested intimate knowledge of his patrol routes. As Robert reconstructed the timeline on his laptop, cross-referencing newspaper clippings with county records, a pattern emerged that sent a chill down his spine. Michael Davis, Paul Davis, and George Brown, the three men in the photograph, had abruptly ceased their bounty hunting activities for exactly 2 months following the marshal's death. This gap in their otherwise consistent work record stood out like a scar on smooth skin. Why would they stop? He wondered aloud, pacing his living room. The researcher knew that 1899 had been a particularly lucrative time for bounty hunters in Wyoming. Outlaws had flooded the territory, driven north by increased law enforcement in Colorado. Any man with tracking skills could have earned a small fortune during those months. Yet these three men, 2 brothers and their cousin, had vanished from the records. No bounties claimed, no appearances in saloon ledgers, not even a mention in the local gossip columns that Robert had painstakingly reviewed at the University of Wyoming archives. The gap gnawed at him. He pulled out the enhanced copy of the photograph, studying their faces for the 100th time. Their eyes held a hardness that went beyond the typical frontier stoicism. These were men who had seen something or done something that had marked them. Robert reached for his phone to call Arthur Johnson. The archivist had connections throughout the state's historical community that might help fill in the blank space in the timeline. As he dialed, a theory began forming in his mind, one that connected Marshal Davis's suspicious death, the serpent-carved rifle now in Michael's possession, and the mysterious 2-month disappearance. "What kept you away from the hunt?" he whispered to the faces in the photograph. "What were you doing when the territory needed men like you most?" The answer, he suspected, lay somewhere in those missing months, a truth that might rewrite everything history had recorded about justice in the wild Wyoming frontier. Julia Martin crossed her arms as she leaned against the doorframe of the archive room, watching Robert Smith's hunched figure with a mixture of concern and professional skepticism. The auction director had built her career on pragmatism, not chasing ghosts through yellowed papers. "You realize this is just a photograph, right?" she said, her voice cutting through the dust-filled silence. "A valuable one, certainly. But you're building quite the dramatic narrative around 3 men we barely know." Robert didn't look up from his magnifying glass. "History isn't just facts, Julia. It's the stories between them." She sighed, approaching the table where the sepia image lay protected under special lighting. The auction house needed a compelling backstory to drive up bids, not wild theories about vengeance and brotherhood, yet something about Robert's dedication had begun to intrigue her. "Show me again what you found," she said, pulling up a chair beside him. For hours they pored over the photograph together, their shoulders occasionally brushing as Robert pointed out details. The tension in Michael Davis's jaw, the way Paul's hand rested near his holster, the weathered lines on George Brown's face that spoke of hardship beyond his years. As midnight approached, Julia's eyes grew heavy. She was about to suggest they continue tomorrow when something caught her attention. A dark shape at the men's feet she'd previously dismissed as a shadow or photographic flaw. "Wait," she whispered, reaching for the magnifying glass. "What's that?" Robert leaned closer, his breath catching. "How did I miss this?" There, sitting faithfully at the edge of the frame, was a dog, its form barely distinguishable from the cabin's shadow, but unmistakable once seen. Its alert posture and watchful eyes seemed to guard the three men, even in this frozen moment of time. "That's not just any dog," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "That's Tracker. Marshal Peter Davis never went anywhere without him." Julia felt a chill race down her spine. The marshal's dog, but if these men had something to do with his disappearance— "Exactly," Robert interrupted, his eyes bright with revelation. "Tracker was legendary for his loyalty. He wouldn't follow anyone who betrayed his master, not ever." The auction director stared at the photograph, suddenly seeing it through new eyes. The presence of the faithful animal transformed everything they'd theorized. This wasn't evidence of betrayal. It was something else entirely. "We've been looking at this all wrong," Julia whispered, no longer the skeptic she'd been hours before. The weight of history pressed around them as they gazed at the four figures, three men and one loyal dog, bound together by something powerful enough to transcend a family feud. The realization hit Robert and Julia like a thunderbolt. Tracker, Marshal Peter Davis's legendary companion, wouldn't have remained with men who had betrayed his master. Dogs possess an intuition humans often lack, and this one's presence spoke volumes about loyalty that transcended death. "Look at how the dog sits." Robert Smith pointed to the barely visible shadow at the men's feet, perfectly at ease, alert but trusting. If these men had anything to do with the marshal's death, that dog would sooner tear their throats out than pose for a photograph with them. Julia Martin leaned closer, her earlier skepticism dissolving as she studied the animal's posture. The auction director had seen countless historical photographs, but none had affected her quite like this one. The emotional weight of what they were uncovering pressed against her professional detachment. "You're right," she admitted, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "I've been approaching this all wrong. This isn't just about authentication or provenance. It's about clearing their names." Robert nodded, his analytical mind already racing ahead. If Tracker trusted them, then Michael, Paul, and George weren't conspirators in the marshal's disappearance. They were something else entirely. The historians spread their collected documents across the table, yellowed newspaper clippings, fragmented diary entries, and transcribed oral histories. Each piece, previously disconnected, now formed a new pattern when viewed through the lens of loyalty rather than betrayal. "What if," Julia suggested, her voice barely above a whisper, "they weren't running from justice, but pursuing it, outside the law perhaps, but with justice as their aim?" Robert's eyes widened. The 2-month gap in their bounty hunting work. They weren't hiding, they were hunting. The pair worked through the night, rearranging their timeline, reinterpreting witness accounts. The three friends had vanished shortly after the marshal's death, only to reappear weeks later, their expressions harder, their eyes haunted by what they had seen, or perhaps by what they had done. "They loved him," Julia said, tracing her finger over Michael Davis's stern face in the photograph. The marshal was family to them, and in those days, in this territory, family justice meant something different. By dawn, Robert and Julia had constructed a new narrative, one of vengeance carried out in silence, of three men who had taken the law into their own hands when official channels failed them. Together, they committed to uncovering the full truth of what had transpired in the aftermath of Marshal Davis's death and what terrible price Michael, Paul, and George had paid to set things right. The dog's unwavering loyalty had changed everything. Sometimes, Robert thought, the most powerful evidence isn't what's written in archives, but what's found in the silent bonds between the living. The basement of the University of Wyoming archives smelled of dust and secrets. Robert Smith and Julia Martin had spent 3 days sifting through boxes of historical ephemera when they discovered a leather-bound journal with water-stained pages. The handwriting inside was cramped but legible. The personal account of a Cheyenne shopkeeper who had witnessed the aftermath of Marshal Peter Davis's murder. "Look at this," Robert said, his voice barely above a whisper. He pointed to a passage dated November 4th, 1899. "He mentions the Red Creek Gang by name." Julia leaned closer, her shoulder brushing against his. "The most vicious collection of cutthroats this territory has ever known," she read aloud. "Even the law fears to speak their names." The Red Creek Gang had been notorious throughout Wyoming. 7 men who robbed stagecoaches, murdered ranchers, and terrorized small towns with impunity. Their leader, a man known only as Blackjack, was rumored to have killed 14 men in cold blood. "Here's another mention," Robert said, flipping through a stack of yellowed wanted posters. The faces staring back at them were hard-eyed men with unkempt beards and cold stares. Each poster bore the same reward, $500 while dead or alive. Arthur Johnson joined them later that afternoon, carrying a leather portfolio filled with newspaper clippings. "I found something interesting," the archivist said, spreading the articles across the table. "The Red Creek Gang disappeared completely in December 1899. No more robberies, no sightings. They simply vanished." The trio pored over local newspaper accounts describing the gang's reign of terror, then the sudden inexplicable silence. One article speculated about internal fighting, another about a move to Montana Territory, but a small notice in the back pages of the Cheyenne Daily caught Julia's attention. "7 unmarked graves discovered near Bitter Creek," she read. "No identification possible." Robert's fingers traced the date. January 12, 1900, less than 3 months after the photograph was taken. "There's more," Arthur said, producing a fragile diary belonging to a rancher's wife. "She writes about 3 riders passing through during a snowstorm, men with haunted eyes and a dog that never left their side." The pieces were beginning to align. The timing of Marshal Davis's death, the photograph of the 3 friends with his rifle, and the mysterious disappearance of the Red Creek Gang, all connected by an invisible thread of vengeance. "They took justice into their own hands," Julia whispered, her eyes meeting Robert's. "The brothers and their cousin, they hunted down every last member of the gang." Robert nodded slowly. "And then they posed for that photograph, with the marshal's rifle as their silent testimony." Outside, snow began to fall on Cheyenne, just as it had that winter long ago when 3 men had ridden out to settle a blood debt in silence. Robert Smith and Julia Martin, hunched over a weathered table in the University of Wyoming archives, surrounded by stacks of yellowed papers, their fingers, stained with the dust of history, carefully turned brittle pages of local news clippings from the winter of 1899. Arthur Johnson had secured them access to private collections normally kept under lock and key, including saloon ledgers from establishments that had long since turned to dust. "Look at this," Julia whispered, sliding a faded newspaper toward Robert. The Cheyenne Daily reported strange sightings near Bitter Creek, 3 riders appearing at dusk, vanishing by dawn. The description matched their photograph subjects perfectly. Robert nodded, his analytical mind connecting threads across time. "And here," he said, pointing to a saloon owner's ledger, 3 men ordering whiskey but barely touching it, paid with gold dust, left before anyone could ask questions. As they pieced together the fragments, a pattern emerged. The Davis brothers and their cousin, George Brown, had systematically tracked the Red Creek Gang across Wyoming's harshest terrain. Unlike lawmen bound by jurisdiction and procedure, they moved like shadows, appearing in small settlements just days after known gang members had passed through. They weren't running from the law, Julia realized, her initial skepticism completely dissolved. They were hunting the men who killed the marshal, Robert carefully arranged a timeline using diary entries from a stagecoach driver who had noted seeing those three grim fellows with the big dog near abandoned mining camps where Red Creek outlaws were rumored to hide. Of the gang had 12 known members, Arthur explained, joining them with fresh documents. And according to these burial records, between November and December 1899, 7 unidentified bodies were discovered in ravines and shallow graves across 3 counties. Julia shivered despite the archive's warmth. Justice delivered in silence. Most telling was a cryptic entry in the personal journal of Cheyenne's deputy sheriff. Davis boys and Brown back in town, asked no questions. Some matters best settled beyond the law's reach. The marshal would understand. Robert studied the photograph again, seeing the 3 men with new eyes. Their expressions weren't those of fugitives, but of men who had completed a terrible duty. The rifle with the serpent carving, the marshal's own weapon, had become an instrument of rough frontier justice. They weren't vigilantes in the common sense, Robert said softly. They were family men who did what the system couldn't or wouldn't do, and then they returned, carrying that burden together. Julia nodded slowly, and they took this photograph as testimony not for the public but for themselves, a record of their pact. The truth was both simpler and more profound than they had imagined. 3 men bound by blood and honor had chosen vengeance over law, but justice over hatred. Arthur Johnson stood in the dim light of the University of Wyoming archives, his fingers tracing the edges of a faded newspaper clipping. For 23 years, he had served as the university's chief archivist, fighting an endless battle against time and indifference. The true West, not the glamorized version from dime novels, was his passion, his obsession. There's something here, he muttered, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The scent of opportunity hung in the air, like the dust motes dancing in the shafts of afternoon light. Robert Smith's investigation had stirred something in Arthur, a chance to leave his mark on history before retirement claimed him. The archivist had watched countless researchers come and go, their enthusiasm fading when faced with the tedium of historical detective work. But Robert was different. His determination mirrored Arthur's own youthful passion, and the photograph they were studying might be the most significant artifact he'd encountered in decades. That evening, Arthur arrived at Julia Martin's office with 3 cardboard boxes filled with overlooked documents. These might help, he said simply, setting them on her desk with reverence. Inside lay fragments of the past, handwritten letters from frontier wives, receipts from general stores listing ammunition purchases, and oral histories transcribed from elderly residents in the 1930s. I've been collecting these for years, he explained, as Julia examined a brittle page. Stories that don't fit the official narrative tend to get buried, but the truth leaves traces. Together, the trio created a timeline on Julia's office wall. Robert pinned up the photograph at its center, while Arthur connected seemingly unrelated events with red string. The archivist's encyclopedic knowledge proved invaluable. He could recall obscure territorial disputes, family connections, and the movements of known outlaws with remarkable precision. The Red Creek gang had informants in the marshal's office, Arthur noted, tapping a dusty journal entry. That's how they knew his patrol route. The ambush wasn't random. As midnight approached, they stood back to survey their work. The wall had become a constellation of tragedy and vengeance. With the 3 friends at its heart, Julia brought coffee as they debated theories, their voices growing hoarse, but their determination unwavering. For Arthur, this collaboration was more than professional courtesy. It was his legacy taking shape before his eyes. Every document he'd rescued from basement boxes, every oral history he'd insisted on preserving despite budget cuts, all of it mattered now. Through Robert's quest, the archivist saw his life's work validated. "A history isn't just facts," he told them, his voice soft but intense. "It's the stories we choose to remember and the ones we let fade away. These 3 men deserve to be remembered." Robert Smith's internal conflict intensified as he sat alone in his cramped apartment, surrounded by photocopies of century-old documents. The sepia photograph of the three men stared back at him from his desk, their weathered faces illuminated by the desk lamp's yellow glow. His historian's training demanded concrete evidence, verifiable dates, authenticated signatures, cross-referenced testimonies, anything that could withstand academic scrutiny. Facts, not feelings, he muttered, rubbing his tired eyes. Yet each time he looked into Michael Davis's unflinching gaze, something deeper than academic curiosity stirred within him. The photograph had become more than a research subject. It was a portal to an unresolved past. He traced his finger along the edge of the image, where Tracker sat faithfully at the men's feet. The rational part of his brain constructed timelines and probability matrices, but his heart sensed something the documents couldn't capture, the weight of a blood oath, the burden of vengeance carried out in silence. Robert poured himself another cup of coffee, now cold and bitter. Julia had texted twice, asking about his progress before tomorrow's meeting with Arthur. He hadn't responded. How could he explain that he'd spent hours simply staring at Michael's face, feeling an inexplicable connection across time? "What were you thinking that day?" he whispered to the photograph. The steely determination in Michael's eyes seemed to hold answers that no archive could provide. Here was a man who had reconciled with his brother despite their bitter feud, who had chosen justice over law, loyalty over personal grievance. The historian in Robert rebelled against such emotional reasoning, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the three friends were silently demanding something from him, not just recognition, but understanding. Their story wasn't merely historical curiosity. It was a testament to sacrifice, to the reconciliation that comes when personal wounds are set aside for something greater. As midnight approached, Robert found himself sketching connections on his whiteboard that would make little sense to anyone else. Lines between duty and vengeance, between family bonds and moral codes. The weight of generations seemed to press down on his shoulders, as if the ghosts of 1899 were standing behind him, watching, waiting for their truth to be heard at last. He picked up his phone to text Julia. "Found something?" he wrote, though what he'd discovered wasn't in any document. It was the conviction that some truths transcend evidence. They must be felt to be understood. And Robert now felt the weight of the three friends' silent pact, as if it were his own burden to carry. The first snow of the season transformed Cheyenne into a pristine landscape of white, the archives building standing like a sentinel against the grey December sky. Robert Smith hunched over a worn leather journal, his fingers carefully turning pages that hadn't seen daylight in over a century. The heating system hummed quietly in the background as he worked late into the evening. The building nearly empty except for the occasional security guard making rounds. "I found something," he whispered to himself, eyes widening at the faded handwriting. The journal belonged to Thomas Wilson, owner of the Silver Dollar Saloon from 1895 to 1910. Robert had requested it on a hunch after cross-referencing locations mentioned in previous documents. The historian's heart quickened as he read the December 12th entry. Thomas had described three men entering his establishment on a night when the temperature had plummeted and snow piled against the saloon's windows. "Strange fellows," the saloon-keeper had written, with the look of men who'd seen the devil himself. Robert immediately called Julia Martin. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tight with excitement. When the auction director arrived, her cheeks flushed from the cold, Robert pointed to the passage. "Look at this description. 3 men, one tall with a scar across his jaw, another with eyes cold as Wyoming steel, and the third with hands that never strayed far from his holster." "Michael, Paul, and George," Julia whispered, recognizing the descriptions from other accounts they'd uncovered. "And there's more," Robert continued. A dog sat at their feet, loyal as shadow to light, refusing scraps from anyone but the 3 strangers. "Tracker," Julia said, her breath catching. "Marshall Davis's companion." The entry described how the men spoke in hushed tones, their conversation guarded. They ordered whiskey but barely touched it, their eyes constantly scanning the room. According to Thomas, they paid with coins that seemed freshly minted, unusual for travelers in the dead of winter. But it was the final line that sent a chill through both Robert and Julia. Justice for the marshal, blood for blood, silence kept. The words were underlined twice, as if Thomas himself could hardly believe what he'd heard or seen. "This confirms everything," Robert said, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "They weren't running from the law, they were delivering it themselves." Julia nodded slowly, her skepticism long since replaced by conviction. "They tracked down every member of the Red Creek Gang," she murmured, "and when it was done, they returned to have their photograph taken, a record of what they'd accomplished together." "A testament," Robert agreed, "and a warning." The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place for Robert Smith. His eyes widened as he connected the final dots in his research. The 2-month gap in the bounty hunter's records wasn't evidence of cowardice or complicity. It was the opposite. Those weeks represented a calculated campaign of vengeance, a shadow war waged across the Wyoming wilderness. "They weren't running from justice," Robert whispered to Julia as they huddled over the documents spread across the archive table. "They were delivering it." The 3 friends, Michael and Paul Davis, along with their cousin George Brown, had systematically tracked down each member of the Red Creek Gang, one by one. The outlaws who had ambushed Marshal Peter Davis disappeared without a trace. No wanted posters announced their capture, no trials were held, no hangings publicly celebrated, just silence and the occasional whisper of frontier justice. "They risked everything," Robert continued, his voice thick with emotion. "Their reputations, their freedom, even their lives, all to avenge the marshal and restore their family's honor." Julia Martin stared at the photograph, seeing the 3 men with new eyes. What she had initially dismissed as just another artifact worthy of auction had transformed into something profound. The weight of their sacrifice, their brotherhood forged in blood and vengeance, seemed to radiate from the sepia image. "This changes everything," she said, gathering her coat. "I need to call an emergency meeting with the auction board immediately." Arthur Johnson looked up from his meticulous notes. What are you planning?" "This photograph isn't just a collectible anymore," Julia replied, determination hardening her features. "It's a testament to the unwritten codes that built the West. Loyalty, justice, and the bonds that transcend even blood feuds." That evening, Julia stood before the auction board, her professional demeanor giving way to passionate conviction. She described how Tracker's presence in the photograph confirmed the men's loyalty to the fallen marshal, how the rifle with its serpent carving had been used not in betrayal but in retribution. "We cannot simply sell this to the highest bidder," she argued. "This photograph represents a crucial piece of American history that deserves proper context and respect." The board members exchanged glances, unused to seeing such fervor from their typically pragmatic director. "What exactly are you proposing?" asked the chairman, leaning forward with interest. Julia took a deep breath. "I believe we have a responsibility to ensure this story is told in full, not just as a curiosity for private collection, but as a historical record that honors these men and what they stood for." As the board deliberated, Robert sat outside the meeting room, the photograph cradled in his hands. In the faces of these 3 men from 1899, he saw not just the past, but a reflection of what justice truly meant in a world where the line between right and wrong was as shifting as the Wyoming sands. News of the discovery spread like wildfire through Cheyenne and beyond. Robert Smith's phone wouldn't stop ringing as historians from the University of Wyoming called hourly, desperate for access to what many were already calling the photograph that rewrote Western justice. Collectors from as far as New York and San Francisco sent representatives with blank checks, eager to claim ownership of this piece of American history. "I've been offered 6 figures," Julia Martin confided to Robert one evening as they sat reviewing their notes in the quiet corner of the auction house. The board is practically salivating. She ran her fingers along the edge of the photograph, now carefully preserved in an acid-free sleeve. But something about selling it feels wrong. Robert nodded, understanding completely. What had begun as historical curiosity had evolved into something sacred, a testament to brotherhood and justice that transcended monetary value. Journalists camped outside the auction house, their vehicles forming a makeshift barrier that employees had to navigate each morning. Television crews requested exclusive rights to film the photograph's unveiling, promising prime-time coverage and international exposure. "The publicity is unprecedented," Arthur Johnson remarked, adjusting his glasses as he surveyed the media frenzy from the window. "We could set records for attendance and bidding." The archivist had spent decades fighting for recognition of Wyoming's historical significance, yet now found himself questioning the commodification of this particular story. As the auction date approached, Julia called an emergency meeting with the board. The men and women seated around the polished oak table fell silent as she stood, shoulders squared with determination. "I cannot, in good conscience, allow this photograph to go to the highest bidder," she announced. "Not without the full story being told." Her voice remained steady despite the murmurs of protest. "This isn't just a collectible. It's the final chapter of Marshall Davis's legacy and the redemption of 3 men who chose honor over hatred." The board chairman leaned forward. "What exactly are you proposing?" "A public presentation," Robert interjected, stepping to Julia's side. "Before any auction, the complete narrative, the feud, the vengeance, the reconciliation, told in its entirety." Julia nodded gratefully at her colleague. These men risked everything to uphold justice when the law failed them. Their story deserves more than a private collection and occasional loans to museums. The room erupted in debate, but Julia stood firm. She and Robert had become guardians of a truth buried for over a century, a story of sacrifice, loyalty, and redemption that belonged not to the wealthy few, but to history itself. The day of the presentation arrived with a palpable electricity in the air. The Museum of Western Justice's main hall had been transformed for the event, with rows of chairs facing a simple podium where the photograph would be displayed. Robert Smith adjusted his collar nervously as attendees filed in, historians, journalists, descendants of Wyoming pioneers, and curious locals drawn by the buzz surrounding the discovery. Julia Martin moved through the crowd with practiced ease, greeting board members and answering questions with diplomatic precision. She caught Robert's eye across the room and offered an encouraging nod. Nearby, Arthur Johnson fussed over the display case, ensuring the lighting perfectly illuminated the sepia image without risking damage to the fragile paper. "Ladies and gentlemen," Julia began as the crowd settled, "what we share today rewrites not just history, but our understanding of justice itself." When she introduced Robert, he approached the podium with reverence. His hands trembled slightly as he lifted the framed photograph, holding it before him like a sacred text. The projection system magnified the image on the wall behind him, 3 weathered faces staring out across more than a century of silence. "Michael Davis, Paul Davis, and George Brown," Robert said, his voice catching as he named each man. 3 friends bound not just by blood and marriage, but by an unbreakable code. The researcher traced their journey with meticulous detail. The bitter property dispute that had torn the brothers apart, the shocking disappearance of Marshall Peter Davis, and the silent pact that had reunited them. His voice gained strength as he described their 2-month absence from town, connecting it with reports of Red Creek gang members found dead in remote cabins and caves. "They didn't seek glory," Robert explained, pointing to the barely visible carving on the rifle. "They sought justice when the law failed them." The audience leaned forward in their seats as he described how the 3 men had tracked down each member of the gang responsible for the marshal's death. Arthur provided documents at key moments, diary entries, newspaper clippings, saloon ledgers, each piece adding weight to the narrative. "And here," Robert said, his finger hovering over the shadow at the men's feet, is perhaps the most telling evidence of all. Tracker, the marshal's loyal companion who would follow only those he trusted. The crowd murmured as the projection zoomed in on the dog's alert form. These men weren't outlaws, Robert concluded, his eyes glistening. Or they were the last guardians of a frontier justice we've forgotten. Men who reconciled their differences to honor something greater than themselves. As he finished speaking, the room fell into a reverent silence, the weight of history bridging the gap between centuries. The silence that descended upon the packed auditorium was almost tangible. Robert Smith stood at the podium, the enlarged photograph projected on the screen behind him, his voice dropping to just above a whisper as he revealed what they had discovered. "Look closely," he said, pointing to the rifle in Michael Davis's hands. "This isn't just any weapon. It's Marshal Peter Davis's personal firearm, marked with the serpent devouring its tail, his symbol of eternal justice." The audience leaned forward as one, straining to see the detail that had eluded casual observers for over a century. Robert continued, his finger moving to the barely visible shadow at the men's feet. "And here sits Tracker, the Marshal's loyal companion who would follow no one but those he trusted. These men weren't fugitives. They were avengers." A soft gasp rippled through the crowd. In the front row, Julia Martin watched faces transform as understanding dawned. She had organized dozens of auctions, but never had she witnessed such a profound connection between artifact and audience. "A look into their eyes," Robert urged, his voice cracking slightly. "These are men who carried out justice when the law failed them, who couldn't forgive themselves for what they had to do, yet would never betray their code." An elderly woman in the third row dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Beside her, a young man who shared her prominent jawline placed his arm around her shoulders. Descendants of the Davis family, Julia realized, witnessing their ancestors' redemption. Arthur Johnson stood at the side of the stage, nodding slowly. The archivist's years of preserving forgotten stories had culminated in this moment, history breathing again, raw and undeniable. They returned to their lives afterward, Robert continued, never speaking of what happened during those 2 months. They carried their burden silently, asking for no recognition, seeking no absolution. A man in worn jeans and a weathered face, clearly from ranch country, removed his hat and held it against his chest. Others followed suit, a spontaneous gesture of respect that spread through the room like a wave. Tears welled in the eyes of strangers and family alike. The story of 3 men bound by blood, divided by conflict, yet united in purpose, had struck a chord that resonated beyond the dusty plains of Wyoming. It spoke of loss that never heals completely, of reconciliation that comes at terrible cost, and of hope that justice, however imperfect, might still be possible. In that moment, the photograph was no longer just a historical curiosity. It had become a mirror reflecting the complicated truths of human nature, our capacity for both terrible vengeance and profound loyalty. The auction board sat in stunned silence as Robert Smith concluded his presentation. The 7 members exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of awe and reverence. Julia Martin watched them carefully, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had fought for this moment, risking her professional reputation on what many had initially dismissed as an obsessive historian's fantasy. "I move that we withdraw the photograph from auction," said Eleanor Winters, the eldest board member, her voice quavering slightly. "Some artifacts transcend monetary value." The vote was unanimous. The sepia image of Michael Davis, Paul Davis, and George Brown would not go to a private collector's vault. Instead, it would become the centerpiece of the Museum of Western Justice in downtown Cheyenne, a testament to the complicated moral code that had shaped the American frontier. "It belongs to everyone," Arthur Johnson whispered as the decision was announced, his eyes misting behind wire-rimmed glasses. The archivist had spent decades preserving fragments of Wyoming's past, often feeling like he was shouting into a void. Now, his work would help thousands understand the true complexity of frontier justice. For Robert, Watching from the podium, the victory felt hollow and profound at once. His research had vindicated three men who had carried their burden in silence, never seeking recognition for their acts of vengeance and loyalty. The historian ran his finger along the edge of his notes, thinking of all the hours spent hunched over faded documents, all the nights wondering if he was chasing shadows. "You've done something remarkable here," Julia told him afterward, touching his arm lightly. Her initial skepticism had long since transformed into fierce advocacy. "You've given them their voice back." Robert nodded, but couldn't shake the weight settling across his shoulders. The three friends in the photograph had walked a dangerous line between justice and lawlessness, between honor and murder. They had avenged Marshal Peter Davis at great personal cost, carrying secrets that had nearly torn them apart. "I wonder if they would have wanted this," he said quietly, "to have their story told." Julia considered this, her professional pragmatism softening. Perhaps not, but some truths need witnesses, even a century later. As they left the auction house, Robert glanced back at the photograph being carefully packed for transport to the museum. The three weathered faces stared back through time, Tracker sitting faithfully at their feet. The dog's presence, that final, crucial piece of evidence, seemed to watch Robert with knowing eyes. The burden of history felt tangible now, not just the responsibility of telling the story correctly, but of honoring the complicated men who had chosen silence over glory, justice over law, and ultimately, brotherhood over vengeance. Julia Martin and Robert Smith stood together in the newly opened exhibition hall, their shoulders nearly touching as they watched visitors gather around the centerpiece display. The journey that had begun with skepticism and professional distance had transformed into something neither had anticipated. What started as an academic exercise had forged a bond between them, built on shared discovery, mutual respect, and the emotional weight of uncovering a century-old truth. "I never thought an old photograph could change so many lives," Julia whispered, her voice catching slightly. The auction director, who had once seen only dollar signs, now understood the true value of what they'd discovered. Robert nodded, his analytical mind still processing the impact of their work. "Some stories refuse to stay buried," he replied, watching as an elderly man wiped away tears while explaining the photograph to his grandson. Arthur Johnson joined them, his posture straighter than usual, pride evident in his bearing. The archivist had spent decades preserving fragments of history that most people overlooked. Now, standing beside his colleagues, he felt his life's work validated in ways he'd never imagined possible. "They would have approved," Arthur said quietly, nodding toward the photograph of Michael, Paul, and George, men who valued truth above all else. The museum buzzed with excited conversations as visitors pressed forward to see the infamous image. Children pointed at Tracker, the loyal dog barely visible at the men's feet, while history enthusiasts debated the implications of the serpent-carved rifle. Old-timers in weathered hats and boots stood silently, nodding in understanding at the hard faces of men who had lived by an unwritten code. A local reporter approached the trio, notepad in hand. "Dr. Smith, Miss Martin, would you say this discovery changes our understanding of frontier justice?" Julia glanced at Robert before answering. Their partnership, once purely professional, had evolved into something neither could easily define, a connection forged through shared purpose and mutual discovery. "It reminds us that history isn't just dates and facts," she replied. "It's people making impossible choices and carrying burdens we can barely imagine." Robert watched her speak, appreciating how far she'd come from the pragmatic auction director who had initially dismissed his theories. Their relationship had deepened through late nights, poring over documents, heated debates about evidence, and moments of breathtaking discovery. As the crowd continued to grow, Arthur placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "We've done something important here," he said, his voice steady. "It's something that will outlast all of us." The three friends stood together, united by the story they had uncovered and the bonds they had formed in the process, a mirror across time to the three men whose loyalty and sacrifice had finally been brought to light. In the quiet aftermath of the exhibition, Robert Smith returned to the archives, finding solace among the yellowed papers and dusty shelves. The photograph that had consumed his waking hours now belonged to history, not just as an artifact, but as a living testament to courage and redemption. Visitors streamed daily into the Museum of Western Justice, their faces reflecting wonder as they gazed upon the three weathered men from 1899. The historian ran his fingers along the spines of leather-bound journals, thinking of Michael and Paul Davis, brothers torn apart by inheritance but united by something far stronger than blood. He thought of George Brown, who stood beside his cousins when vengeance called, and of Tracker, whose loyalty transcended even death. "You found what you were looking for." Arthur's voice broke the silence as the archivist appeared between the tall shelves, his eyes crinkling with understanding. "More than I expected," Robert admitted, "though I suspect there are still secrets we'll never uncover." Outside, the Wyoming wind howled against the windows, carrying echoes of a past both brutal and beautiful. Robert had spent his career chasing ghosts through documents, but never before had he felt them so present, so alive in the spaces between fact and legend. Julia called that evening, her voice warm with the camaraderie that had grown between them. "The governor wants to attend next month's special exhibition," she said. "Seems your three friends have become quite the celebrities." "They would have hated that," Robert laughed, picturing the stoic faces in the photograph, men who did what needed doing, then disappeared back into the shadows. Later, as darkness settled over Cheyenne, he stood before the museum display one last time. The photograph, now expertly preserved and prominently featured, seemed to pulse with untold stories. The serpent carving on the rifle, the loyal dog at their feet, the hard-won peace in their eyes, all pieces of a puzzle that had waited over a century to be solved. Robert placed his palm against the glass, a gesture both reverent and familiar. "I promise," he whispered to the three friends, "your story will never be forgotten." The researcher knew that history was never truly complete. It lived and breathed in the telling, in the questions asked and the truths revealed. Some secrets would remain buried, but what mattered most had been brought into the light. Loyalty that transcended feuds, justice that outlived the law, and redemption that spanned generations. As he turned to leave, Robert felt the weight of their legacy settle comfortably on his shoulders. The past had offered its gift of understanding, and he had accepted it with both hands.